Thank you, everybody, for coming out to Vegas Programmers Meetup. Established in 2014, was it? And we've still been going. So I've gone through a couple of organizers, but I've been hosting this now, I think, for about 6 years, just because when I was going to college for programming, there was no meetup. And not having people to bounce ideas off of or learn from can be very frustrating when you're in a siloed environment. So this is why I created this. So I'm glad you all are here because we have an awesome, I don't know if it's not a talk this time because who here was last month? Okay, we've got one. Okay, well, at least someone. But so last month, Amin talked about interviewing at big tech companies, what to expect, things to prepare for. And we didn't have time to jump into it, but we wanted to do a mock interview, essentially with one of you lucky volunteers, where Amin, who's worked at Meta and other big companies, who has experience in interviewing, would like to give what would be a mock interview, what you could expect at some of these big tech companies. So I guess who here is looking for a job right now? They're currently searching. Okay, so of you, who would like to volunteer? Okay, we've got one. Cool. All right, come on down. You're the next contestant on this mock interview. All right, first before we get started, what's your name?
Jay.
Jay? Okay, and how long have you been coding?
4 or 5 years.
Okay, cool. So enough to be dangerous, right?
Caveat there, I'm not a software engineer. I'm like a data engineer.
Okay, no, that's fine. That's fine. Cool. So yeah, do you want to just jump right into it, or do you have him?
We have a few slides just to.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe just grab a seat then, and then he'll pull you up here. All right, let's go.
Let's do it. How you doing, folks? My name's Amin. We're doing a live workshop on big tech coding interviews. I need that thing. Thank you, sir. Let me clip this on my, there we go. Awesome. So we're doing a workshop on big tech coding interviews. So who am I and why am I qualified to talk about this? I'm Amin. I'm a consultant. I help teams scale, launch, and operate their services using DevOps and SRE. I worked at Facebook for 3 years as a production engineer and a production engineering manager. Which means two things. Number one, I actually went through the interview process and survived. And number two, I got trained on how to interview other candidates. So what are we doing today? We're going to do a live coding interview right here, right now. And the really cool part about it is that if you're looking to work for a large company like this, you're going to get the feeling of what it's going to be like. And if you're the person in the chair, you're definitely going to know what it's going to be like. So agenda. We need to find a volunteer. Hi, Jay. So we got that going. We're going to talk about some ground rules. I was expecting a lot of people in here, but that's all good. But we do have some ground rules. We'll do the interview itself, which is just going to take 20 minutes. And then we as a group are going to provide some feedback on how the interview went. So there's 4 pieces of criteria that tech companies look at. When they're looking at an interview, we're going to go through them and we're going to assess and give Jay some constructive and supportive feedback on how we can do better at a future real interview, and then finally do some Q&A. Sound good? Yep. Right on, let's go. So, step 1, find a volunteer. We got Jay, come on down. So we'll have you have a seat. I have my laptop prepped for you, and I'll get you in the environment shortly. Here, let me shake your hand. It's a pleasure, sir. You too. Here, you take that. So, you've accepted the challenge. You're going to be doing a 20-minute simulated programming interview. Again, we're going to discuss how it went, and you're going to earn glory and respect from your peers. All right? Okay. Right on, Jay. So, some ground rules. Jay, this is for you. When doing the programming interview, you're going to think out loud. So we're going to have a discussion as you code, as you're putting together the solution, the problem I have prepared for you. I don't know the last time you've done a programming interview, but write the brute force solution first. Don't do fancy stuff because you might run out of time. You're going to get follow-up questions and feedback from me. I have this question prepared. I know a few ways to attack it, so I'll be interacting with you as you after you get your first attempt out. No Google searches. You're just going to have a window with text, and we're going to start writing code in it. Audience, 2 rules. No questions or interruptions during the interview. We're going to keep things as close to an actual interview as possible. And then after the interview, we are going to be supportive and provide constructive feedback to how we did. Because this is vulnerable. He's coming in front of all of us and coding, as a form of performance. So let's give him, a really good supportive environment here. Okay, and why am I saying that? Because the credit belongs to the person who's actually in the arena. If you're in this chair, you already got glory already. Cool. It's interview time. You ready?
No. Yes.
All right, man, I think you're going to do just fine. So let's switch you to the second thing. We got a question there. Is that big enough? Yeah. All right on. So I'm going to get into character, and we're going to do this thing for real. And I got my notebook. I'm going to take notes, and it's going to be like I'm doing a for real interview when I was working for Meta. So this is going to be an interesting experience for you. Getting into character, I got a script. Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate that. And by the way, this script is basically the things I said during an actual interview. Character time. Thank you for attending today's coding interview. My name's Amin, and I'm a Site Reliability Engineering Manager at Megacorp. I help engineering teams better launch, deploy, and monitor their services. Today's interview will last 20 minutes, where you will be working on a programming problem. If you've seen this problem before, please let me know. If you have any clarifying questions, please ask. You may use any programming language you like, and it is okay if we run out of time today when we're working on this problem. Are you ready to begin?
I think so.
Right on. I'm going to go ahead and set the timer for 20 minutes, and then we'll get started. All right. So, an anagram is a word or phrase formed by rearranging the letters of a different word or phrase using all the original letters exactly once. For example, the word cinema is an anagram of the word Iceman. Write a function where, given 2 strings, returns true if they are anagrams of each other, otherwise return false.
Okay. So just to kind of reiterate the question,
Sure.
What we're given is 2 strings, and the goal is to figure out if the count of each letter in each string matches the other string. Is that fair? Is that a fair?
The count of each letter. So you mean the total number of letters?
No, so the total number of letters will kind of be part of it.
Yes.
But if I have, let's say, 2 A's in string A, or string 1 and 2 A's in string B, then it's kind of the count of those 2. So there's 2 A's in first and 2 A's in second. Okay.
That makes sense.
Okay, so I think the first thing that I'd like to do is maybe create kind of a function. If I were writing this in production code, then I'd probably have a function that would accept these 2 strings and have some kind of a return value.
Sure.
So maybe I'll just write I'll use Python as my language. That's what I'm most familiar with.
Excellent.
And then maybe I'll just say is anagram.
Okay.
And it's going to be accepting 2 strings. So maybe I'll say S1, and that's a string. S2 also a string. And the goal is to return a Boolean value here. So that's what I'll have it return.
Yep. Makes sense.
Okay, now the first thing that I need to do is I need to figure out how can I actually count the letters in each of the strings. Well, if I have some kind of a hash map that keeps track for string 1 and then a hash map that keeps track for string 2, then I can compare both hash maps and see if they are equivalent. So in this case, I would have 2 hash maps. However, one kind of thing that I'm thinking of right now is that maybe I don't actually need 2, because if I just have 1, then I can just add, if I have a hash map that's something like this, right? If I have A, 0, B, 0, whatever, so on and so forth, I can kind of iterate through string 1 and I can add all the A's, all the B's, so on and so forth. And then when I get to the second string, I can just subtract from there and then just go and check if each of the integers in this hash map is 0. And that would be another way to kind of save on some memory. Alternatively, I could use a list to keep track of my letters as well, because there's only 26 letters in the alphabet. And that actually brings me to another question. Can I assume that they're all going to be lowercase letters, or do we also have uppercase letters involved in here?
That's a really good question. For the sake of simplicity, let's assume 26, the 26 letters lowercase.
Okay, cool. So maybe I'll start writing kind of the first brute force solution that I can think of here. So that would be iterating through the first string and then iterating through the second string. So maybe I can just have for character in S1. And I will need to first also create my hash map here. So let's just say letter count 1 and just define that as a hash map here. And then what I can do is I can, as I'm iterating through this string, what I can do is I can check if this letter already exists in my hash map. If it does, then I can add 1 to it. If not, I can set it to a default of 0 and then add 1 to it.
Okay.
So I can have letter count 1 equals letter count 1 dot get. And then I want to get the letter C and set it to a default of 0 and then just add 1 to it. And so now I have a hash map that has all of my letters from string 1, and I can do the same thing for string 2. And I can first maybe define that hash map here. So same thing here. And then all I would need to do at the end here is just to return letter count 1 equals letter count 2. And then that would tell me if both strings are anagrams of one another.
Okay. How about putting together some examples and doing like a manual test?
Sure.
Let's verify.
Sure. Am I able to run code in this environment?
No.
Okay. So maybe I can have, so what I'll do is I'll create kind of a test case here. There's a few different types of cases, right? Either the two strings are anagrams, and this would mean that they are, same length and same number of each character in both strings.
Okay.
They could be, not anagrams. In this case, they could be different lengths. Or if they are the same length, then it could also be different number of characters in both strings. So when I say different number of characters, I mean the strings could be the same length, but we might have like more A's in string 1 than
The
string 2.
frequencies, sure.
Yeah, frequencies, that's what I mean. Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
And I believe that kind of covers our test cases. In this case, I'm assuming that the user is providing a string here. But if they were not, maybe we could have an assert statement at the beginning just to check that they're both of type string. If that's something that we want to include, we can do that too.
I appreciate you calling it out, but yeah, let's just assume that the inputs are always going to be the 26 letters of the alphabet lowercase. But,
Sure.
Yeah, appreciate the defensive programming thinking.
Sure, that sounds good. So in that case, my first test case can be test case where they are anagrams. So maybe I can have I can just have an assert statement that says is anagram, and I can, let's say I have S1 as like 3 A's and S2 as also 3 A's, and then this assert statement should return true. So I'm going to be doing this. If it is not true, then it will throw up an exception. I know that it has not passed the test case.
All right.
And then I can also write an assert statement here for the first case where it's not an anagram, which is if they're different lengths.
Right.
So maybe I can just have A here, and in this case, I can just have B's. It doesn't really matter. It should return false in any case. And then my third case here is that they are the same length, but they have the different number of characters in both strings. So, different frequency of characters. So maybe like AAA, and then AAB or something like that, and that should return false here. So it's calling the function, it's passing through the 3 test cases that I've thought of here. Maybe one additional one is if it's an empty string. I don't know if that would really matter in this case because we're still counting the frequencies here in both. So if we have an empty hash map in one compared to a hash map that is populated, the kind of the answer at the end of the day should still be the same.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, this is a reasonable brute force attempt. Okay, so I have some feedback or some follow-up questions particularly. So let's talk about length checking. So let's say, for the moment, that the 2 strings supplied are very, very large.
Sure.
And you're having to construct these hash maps and then doing the comparisons and doing everything. Are there opportunities here to exit execution early and return like a false or something? Are there certain conditions where we can improve the performance?
Okay, so you're saying, if I understand correctly, is there a way for us to, prior to us actually executing both strings in their entirety, if we already know that the answer is false, then we can just return false?
Correct.
Did I understand correctly?
Yeah,
Okay.
how do we, exactly.
Okay, so I mean, one thing that I can think of here is if we were to sort both strings from the beginning, then we can just iterate through them, through each letter one by one in both strings simultaneously. And then if at any point 2 letters are not the same, then we can immediately return false because the letters should be sorted in ascending order from A to Z anyways.
That is one potential way to do it. The only thing is, if you do have to end up sorting at least one of the strings completely, the best performance you're going to get is n log n.
Yes.
Right. So reasonable, yes. Is there any other way that we can interrupt execution? So let's think of the simple one. In your code here, what would we do if we knew that the lengths of both strings were just not equal?
We could just return false and you can check the length as a first step in the function.
All right, let's pop that in there.
Okay, so I can say, if not, or if len s1 is not equal to len s2, I can just return false from there.
Cool. All right. So that will deal with that your second case immediately without doing any computation or very little computation. That's awesome. All right. So back to the second part. Tell me a little bit about your idea of using only one hash map. I found that interesting. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the idea of using the one hash map would be so that if we were to iterate through one string first, then we would know we would be adding. So we can say the frequency is, let's say, 2 A's, 3 B's, whatever. And then if we iterate through the second string, then we can just subtract from there. So then at the end of the day, we know that if that one hash map has a value of 0 corresponding to each key, which is a letter, then we know that they're both anagrams. However, I think in this case, I would have to implement it differently because in the case where both strings are not anagrams, and because they have different frequencies, then I would have to initiate my hash map with all the letters and a corresponding value of 0, because if I'm searching for a letter that does not exist in the hash map, it would throw up an exception. But also, in terms of space complexity, I don't think it will have that big of an impact because the largest that this hash map can get is 26 keys in both cases, so it might not save us that much memory at the end of the day anyways.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Okay. How about it? Would you like to implement that solution? I think that might be very interesting.
Sure. Okay, so I can keep this length check as is. And then what I can do is I can set up letter counts and just set that up as my hash map. So I'll have C for character and then 0 for C, and I can maybe import string up here. And since we assumed lowercase, I'll just use ASCII lowercase here.
Okay.
So now I've initialized this hash map with each letter of the alphabet and set that to 0 initially.
Okay.
So then I can get rid of this letter count 1 here and just change that to, or I can just get rid of it here altogether. And then for each character in S1, I can set this letter count. I know that the key will exist in my dictionary, so I don't need to use the get function anymore. I can just reference the letter that I'm at, and I can add 1 to it.
Yep.
And I can get rid of this over here as well. And maybe it's actually possible, instead of iterating through one first and then iterating through the next one, I can kind of just iterate through them both at the same time by index rather than by character. So that way I don't need to do 2 passes. If maybe that's something you want me to implement right now, or maybe we can get to that later.
We'll get to that later. Yeah, let's stick
Sure.
to the current challenge here.
So then what I can do is I can change this to letter count, and again get rid of this get function.
Yep.
And instead of adding 1, I could just subtract 1 and reference the correct key. And then what I would do is I would say I would need to make sure that every value in my dictionary is equal to 0. So then I could just iterate through that dictionary and make sure that that is true. So maybe I can just say, for v in letter count dot values, because we don't care which frequencies are different, so I don't need to iterate through the keys. Then I can just say, if v is not equal to 0, then return false. And then just as kind of an implied else condition, I can return true.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Again, reasonable. So let's go back to the previous follow-up I had, because I think that it still applies here. Imagine for a moment that the 2 strings that we pass in are absurdly long. Are there any other ways that we can interrupt flow of execution? So we've done the, we are checking for length, and that's really simple. Are there conditions, for example, in your lines 19 and 20, are there conditions in that code where you can detect that, hey, we're obviously not?
I think there is, because ideally we want this to equal 0.
Yes.
But if any of these keys get to a point where it's below 0, then we know that it will never get back up to 0.
Okay.
So maybe we can have a check in that second string to say, if letter count at C is less than 0, then we can just immediately return false here.
Yeah, that definitely would address it, for sure. Okay.
And I guess then, in this case, we would not be able to do the case that I hypothesized about earlier, where we can iterate through them both at the same time, because you can have letters in 2 different places and the frequencies might be the same, but we don't want to end execution early in the event that we get less than 0 in that case.
Got it. All right. You know what? I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and we're like 4 minutes away from the end. Usually at this moment, I would start to scramble and try to find follow-up questions, but we've exhausted this problem pretty well. So I'm going to go ahead and end it here and follow through with the remaining part of the script. All right, time's up. Again, it's totally okay that we ended without finishing whatever we're working on. Actually, you did finish it. We covered a lot of ground. I'll be providing feedback on this interview to the recruiting team within the next 24 hours. So you'll be hearing from us on next steps really soon. Again, thanks so much, Jay, for joining me today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep, definitely a pleasure. Give him a round of applause. All right, I'll take that laptop back. Thank you, sir. You did really well.
Thank you.
And we're going to discuss the details about that right now. Stand by. All right, so this is audience participation time. And we're going to evaluate how this interview went. And don't allow my emotions to bias you. Let's look at this objectively. So there are 4 things that when I'm evaluating an interview or anybody in big tech, they tend to look at these 4 things. So we're going to look at each of them together. Number 1 is communication. Number 2 is problem solving. Number 3 is technical competency. And number 4 is testing. So let's start from the beginning. Did Jay ask clarifying questions about the problem? I see nods. Yes, he did. He was asking about the inputs that are acceptable. He was asking about like, oh, can I do upper, lower case? So he was clearly making sure that he understood the problem as well as what the types of input should be. Did he describe the approach, implementation, and execution flow? Right. So he did describe the approach. He's like, okay, I'm going to go and instantiate these two hash maps. I'm going to load them up and compare them, or create one hash map, increment, decrement, and see what's left. Great. And then did he politely handle feedback and questions in interviewer? He was a class act, absolutely was. So I think on the communication side, we have very good signal that this was good, right? Next, problem solving. Did he demonstrate understanding of the problem? So he repeated back to me and made sure I understood that he understood. So I would say yes. What about the appropriate selection of data structures and algorithms? So he decided to use a hash map. Was that a reasonable tool for the job? All right, I think so too. Did we weigh approaches based on time and space complexity? There was a couple mentions of that here. Granted, this is a very simple question, so there wasn't really much of an opportunity to talk about time and space. He was mentioning for a brief moment, talking about sorting the two strings, at which point you would have n log n of the time of sorting. And then finally, optimizing solution independently of response to feedback. So I threw maybe like one bone, but he drove most of this. And when I was asking him some questions, you know, he was replying and iterating. When I gave him that one clue about, hey, is there a way you can terminate execution early? He was like, oh yeah, I could go and see if my frequency is below, less than 0, I know I'm dealing with two strings that are not anagrams of each other. So he figured that one on his own, which is pretty awesome. So problem solving, I think we're pretty good signal, right? All right, technical competency. Oh, time's up. There we go. Technical competency. What language is this? Does it look like syntactically correct Python to you? Yeah, I'd say so too. He wrote a solution in Python. I actually did this question yesterday, and your style was actually better than mine. One of the things he did is he actually annotated his function. We know what the types are supposed to be, and we know what the return type is. I didn't write it when I did that because I'm a sysadmin and I forget to do type annotations. So I think, yeah, this is a Python solution. And it looked syntactically correct, which is great. So again, technical competency, Jay has pretty good marks. And then finally, testing. So I asked him, hey, can we put together some test cases? He thought about the various types of input we could get, and he wrote several. Some feedback. In settings like this, especially if you're doing it on the marker board, they're probably going to want you to like write out test cases and then walk through the code manually. But other than that, like you answered the question. Self-correcting of bugs. Are you a machine? Because I didn't notice in any instance where you were writing like some bugs in there, and for me to catch it, be like, hey, you know, it isn't indented properly. No, you just wrote the code well. Like you know what's going on. So back to the beginning here. How did Jay do? Great. So let's give him a round of applause.
Thanks, guys.
So now granted, to be clear, a question like this would probably be like a warm-up, right? Because when you're doing a big tech interview, they're going to have some questions that are going to be slight brain teasers. But given the information that I got in the 20 minutes sitting with you and seeing you go through the problem and discuss it, I would definitely send you to the next interview round. So I think you did really well. Congratulations.
Thank you. Appreciate it a lot.
Awesome.
And thanks everyone for the feedback too.
Yeah. So I want to pause and ask for questions and feedback about the session, about interviews in general, because I know most of you in this room didn't see last month's session.
I'd open it up to Jay too. Do you have
Yeah, absolutely.
like about the interview
Not off the top of my head, no.
Okay. Well, if you kick us out of the yellow now.
Sure, will do.
Here.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again, Jay.
Thanks again, Jay. That was awesome. Yes, sir.
I think some people say for paying interviews, they spend like 3 to 6 months studying algorithms, questions on root code. Is that common?
So it definitely can be. So if you're applying for a software engineering role, as opposed to a production engineering role or or site reliability engineering role, yeah, the questions are going to be much more algorithms heavy.
Oh, so the role depends. I thought
The role depends. So I'm in the production engineering SRE side. I'm more of like an ops DevOps person. So I can write code, obviously, but the problems they're going to give to me are going to be a bit different. They're going to be more like, yes, they're going to expect you to pick the proper data structures and go through that scenario as Jay just did, but they're not going to be giving me like, hey, here's a binary tree, go traverse the tree. They're going to have me do like file IO and text manipulation and that sort of thing, right? So it's a little bit different. But the answer is yes. For SWE, it's going to be pretty algorithmic, and you will need to take the time to practice. And that was one of the major points of last month's talk.
yes, what are the 3? There's SME, there's a software engineer, but the one you were.
Oh, software engineer, and then it's like Google has 2. It's software engineer and then site reliability. And so Facebook has production engineering, which is basically the equivalent of site reliability engineering at Google. It's just they have a different name for it.
Is that like DevOps?
That's an entirely different talk, but yeah, kind of. Yeah, it's more of a focus on using software to solve operations problems. But yes, excellent question. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I noticed at the beginning you asked them the question, have you seen this problem before? What would have been your response when you said, yes, I've seen this before?
Well, in that case, I usually have a second question prepped.
Really?
If I am a well-prepared interviewer, I'd have a second question, or I might go for it and just be like, and then they just have a higher bar. I would be like, oh, if you did the question before, well, then I'm going to, really pay attention to what you're providing, and then ask you some of the higher level stuff.
So the next question will be harder than that first one?
Oh, of course. So like this was a 20-minute interview. The interviews tend to take 45 minutes, and they're composed of 2 questions. The first question is kind of like this. It's a warm-up. Right? The second one is where the meat and potatoes are, and you're going to be really getting into it. But since this is a time-constrained thing, I did a simpler question in a 20-minute time frame. Very good. Good question. Any others? All right. I think you've been raising your hand a couple times in the back, so I want to give you the floor.
Tell us what you see yourself, like the role you see yourself in as an interviewer, in terms of like the help and hints you're providing or lack thereof. What's your role in the coding process?
Sure. So, number one, my role is to expose as much signal as possible, meaning those 4 things. So I want to give the candidate as much of an opportunity as possible to demonstrate these 4 things. So if I was just silent and didn't, provide some feedback or throw a bone sometimes, I wouldn't necessarily get a good quality interview. So that way when I go to the interview board and provide feedback, I can't say with confidence, right, that the candidate is performing well or didn't. If I was just silent and I just let them do whatever, I wouldn't be guiding them in the right direction. Also, 45 minutes is not a lot of time. So if there's ways for me to kind of like redirect, the investigation of a problem or certain approaches, I again get the opportunity to gather that signal. So that's what my role is. Also to just make the interviewee or the candidate comfortable, because frankly, Jay did something pretty awesome here in that he sat in front of all of you and did this. In an actual interview, there's only 1, maybe 2 people that you're hanging out with. So this is, it's my responsibility to make them feel comfortable and relaxed and, do a little bit of emotional management because it can be high stress. Good question. I think you had something there?
Yeah, I had a question.
Yes.
So Jay was able to choose Python in the language that he was coding in.
Yeah.
Is it more just depending on what role you're interviewing for, or who the interviewer is, or who you're interviewing for? Would they tell you beforehand whether you can choose your language, or would they specify you should only be able to code in X, Y, and Z? Or
So the recruiter tends to ask what languages you are most comfortable with. So that way they can pair you with an interviewer that is familiar with that language. When I applied for Facebook, I was doing a lot of stuff in Ruby. So they paired me off with an interviewer that knew enough Ruby to be dangerous and could provide me, feedback on it. The one thing I will say about language choice, so don't do shell scripting languages. That is usually something that is off limits because, yeah, you can do really fancy bash one-liners to solve your problem, but then you're not really getting, again, the signal that you need. So we tend to focus on full-blown interpreted or compiled languages. We might also dissuade you from choosing certain languages. Like if you did, I saw someone who did an interview in C, and they crashed and burned because it took so long for them to instantiate the data structures from scratch in order for them to tackle the problem. But usually we say, just tell us what your favorite language or languages are, and then we'll make sure that there's someone available to interview you knowing that stuff. Good question. Who's next? Yes, sir.
So I'm wondering, I've been through a couple of interviews like this where they just give you like Notepad or something and go ahead and code it.
Yes.
So if you don't have like a full-blown IDE with IntelliSense and everything like that, how big of a deal is it that the code actually compiles?
Oh, you mean how big of a deal is that the quality of the code is compilable?
Yeah. So that you're using actual code instead of like pseudocode here to do this thing and.
Yeah, it's so. What I said at last month's talk is that one thing you have to understand is that the programming interview, in a sense, is a game, right? And there's a contrived set of circumstances we're placing the candidate in, which includes writing on a marker board or typing into a text editor without your tools in it. So if I saw a bug, or if I knew that it wouldn't compile, I mean, it would be feedback that I'd provide to the candidate, but it wouldn't be like disqualifying. I'm not expecting a candidate to write perfect code, even though Jay somehow did. That's not the expectation here. The expectation is that the human being, is writing code in the text editor, and if he did find something, that he catches it and addresses it. It's not really about writing perfect code, and I wouldn't expect that. Like, for example, during one of my interviews, there was a function call that I knew I needed to use, but I didn't remember the name. So I just told the interviewer, okay, I forgot what this thing is, and I forgot what the argument should be, but I'm just going to make one up and write it in. And I worked at Facebook for 3 years. It didn't kick me out because I said that. I think they're more concerned about honesty and speaking to your limitations rather than being perfect. Good question. Any others? Yes, sir.
So one of the first phases for the interviewee is to come up with an intuition on how to solve it, right? So for literally a problem they've never seen before. So
Yes.
What are your recommendations on either preparation or just in that moment on how to get over that hurdle of the initial solve?
Yeah, so practice is obviously important. There's a really good book that I recommend, like folks that are getting ready to do this type of thing. It's called Cracking the Coding Interview. And the reason why that book is really useful is that they have a question bank that goes over different classes of problems. So all the problems you're going to get are going to fall into one of those things. So if you're practicing them enough, it's going to be easier for you to build like a heuristic of, oh, okay, this is like some bitwise math nonsense, or, oh, I'm doing some text manipulation, or, oh, I have to create some data structure and do this. So like that type of exposure is going to prepare you for choosing the right tools for the problem. Another interesting point is, and as you saw in my rules back here, because I didn't know what Jay was going to bring me. I wanted to make sure that the candidate wrote the brute force solution first, even if it was like O(n) squared complexity. At least you got the problem on the board. So I guess my answer to your original question is you just need enough exposure to these types of problems so that way like the general direction to go. Yes, sir.
I think Meta has a great, if you item Java Meta, they actually have like this whole cracking the coding interview thing sectioned off. And it's a great place to consume that book because the book is huge. The Meta
Yeah.
makes it, I think, in a very nice way. If you apply
That's good insight. I'll tell you something about Meta. Their recruiting department is very, very nice, and the materials they'll send you is golden. If you follow their instructions on how to prepare, they're basically telling you what's going to happen. Nothing should come as a surprise. So, like that type of guidance, use it. Avail yourself of it, and you'll be more prepared than candidates that just roll in without any practice at all. But yeah, that's a very good point, and I'm not surprised that's the case. I didn't get that when I interviewed, but they gave me a free course for systems design, right? And then I read it, and I'm like, okay, this is the game we're going to play for this, and I went and did it. So it was good. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's me again. I wasn't here last month, so you might have answered this last month in the last meeting.
It's okay.
Based on what you've seen or heard secondhand or your own experiences interviewing as an interviewer, what are some like red flags or things that you don't want to see when you're interviewing someone?
Oh, what an interesting question. Yeah, what do I not want to happen? Well, let's go through the 4 things. So, number 1. It's not good to have candidates that are entirely quiet and it's just silent and they're just coding up a storm. Particularly, they just jump straight to the code. You saw what Jay did. He was like, let me make sure I understand the question. I have some questions about what the solution should be like. I'm expecting to write a function with this return code and these inputs. Does that make sense? So like there is this negotiation that's happening about what the initial implementation should be. And what is not good to have happen is candidates just going straight in, silently just writing stuff up, because coding is a collaborative exercise. And that would provide a signal that, oh, are they going to collab with me if they were on my team and I needed to sort out a problem with them? So that's something you don't want to have happen. Other red flags, well, I mean, they might pick, inappropriate data structures or algorithms. They might choose and assert solutions that are time and space complex. They might be defensive on the solution rather than taking your feedback. They might try to write the whole thing in pseudocode and skate around the idea that you need to write actual code. So there's certain behaviors that aren't going to provide good signal. But when it comes to red flags, it's going to be across these 4 dimensions. Very good question. Any other ones? It's been a good dialogue so far. I'm really happy with what we're talking about here.
I got one.
Yes, sir.
So I got 2 questions. Well, one of them, can Jay just use this recording to skip the next interview he's got to go on because he did a great job? Just send them this YouTube link.
I mean, you should. You should. I mean, if anything, it's kind of like clipping out of the screen. Oh, the dude can do an interview live. All right, we can get him straight into the interview round. You know what I'm saying? So, I would, if I was the hiring manager, I would say so.
So my real question is related around more like, I don't want to call it soft skills, more like, I guess, people skills. I don't know.
Interpersonal?
One thing I've always struggled with as someone in your seat is judging whether the person's going to be like a good cultural fit. Right?
Yes.
Like the technology side of things, I've met some outstandingly smart people that are just maybe rude or whatever. They have their quirks, right?
Yes.
But it's hard to find that in an hour sitting with them or whatever in an interview, right?
That's correct.
So are there certain things you do to try to catch on those little things? Like what are maybe some things that, even if they're stories that you've been through or little tidbits that you've noticed that are useful for judging whether a candidate's going to be a good fit for that team or something like that?
That's a very good question. So, number 1, if you are interviewing for a software engineering role, this isn't the only interview you're going to do. So when I interviewed at Meta, I interviewed as a manager, and I had coding, systems, some behavioral interview where we're talking about incident response, systems design, and then another management one. So a couple of those interviews were behavioral in nature. So they're actually paying attention to not just my answers, but also how I would respond to certain situations. Like, for example, a manager needs to be able to provide clear feedback and hold their teammates accountable to expectations, right? If they're a people pleaser and they can't have those conversations, that is a red flag behavior because now the manager can't lead their team. So for any big tech company, you're going to have behavioral interviews that are going to assess that specifically, not in here. However, I will say this. I did have a candidate that went through the process a long time ago. It was pre-Meta. It was for a system, like a cloud system enroll. And this guy went through all the interviews, and the last interview was, I guess, like just a sysadmin interview with a female member of the team, Emily. And he went through the interview with her, and he was doing everything in flying colors, but he said one thing that totally killed it. He said, "Wow, you're really smart for a woman."
Oh boy.
And it just, non-hire. Non-hire.
Yeah.
It was just like, it was the most like disappointing thing, because technically the guy was obviously strong, but at the end, like, massive red flag. Like, he was being absolutely disrespectful, and we couldn't hire him. So usually there are behavioral interviews in larger companies that deliberately screen for things that wouldn't fit well in the culture.
Have you ever had them meet the team first, like for lunch or something like that before a hire? Is that like a decent?
Yeah, that happens more at Google. Google has like the most it's like the longest interview process, the most grueling interview process. And basically after you interview, they have you meet the team and you're like chatting with them a bit before they extend an offer to you. So it's a bit longer. At Meta, they do something a bit different. So when you get hired, you're not placed on a team. That's the thing that's really interesting about really large organizations. So when you apply for smaller companies, medium-sized companies, it's like, oh, you're applying for a role on a team. That is not so in big tech. In big tech, particularly in my experience, you get hired and then you go to boot camp, which is like a training period for like 4 to 6 weeks. And then after your 4th week, you go into, you are marked as, you're available to be reached out to by other teams. So it's like this big dating app situation where you're, a new hire on the scene, and everyone reaches out to you and says, "Hey, you want to sit with our team for a few days? We got some tickets for you. The team's awesome." So when it comes to that sort of thing, like the team interview, and it's not even an interview. It's more of just like getting to know you and seeing what vibes well and what doesn't. That happens after the interview process, not before.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. Any others?
Is Microsoft similar?
I don't know enough folks at Microsoft to speak with confidence. I know a lot of Googlers, and I know a lot of Metamates, they call them now.
Metamates?
Oh,
okay.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Right on. So that's my contact information. I am a consultant at my one-man army, Certo Modo. Again, I focus on helping tech companies build, launch, and operate their services using DevOps and SRE. Feel free to reach out. I have a blog with a lot of interesting stuff on it. And thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Did you ever meet Mark?
Interesting story. On my first day, I was in the company headquarters in Menlo Park, California, and I was hanging out in a courtyard in the new building they built there, and I saw Mark cross from one side of the courtyard to the other. I've never spoken to him in person.
Was he surrounded by bodyguards?
No, I mean, he should have been. That was kind of interesting that he wasn't. All right, man, you have the floor, sir.
All right, so I'm going to do a little lightning talk here. No slides necessarily. Really more not even a workshop. It's just something that I'm working on a talk for a conference later this year. The talk is gonna revolve around server optimization, as well as like PHP optimization. But we're gonna skip the PHP part. We're just gonna talk about server optimization for today. And I want this to be like, I know that there's some server folks out there. Interrupt me and bring up other things that maybe are dovetailing from a topic that I'm talking about, or other things that I'm not taking into consideration because I want to make this talk as good as it can be. So, so servers, right? I'm going to mainly just talk about the Linux world. I'm sorry for the Microsoft people out there. I probably should think about maybe putting in a couple of tidbits if somebody does have Microsoft experience out here for web servers. What is it, IIS or ISS, whatever it is. But I'm going to mainly talk about Linux. So first thing, as far as like server optimization, the very first thing I can think of, like what are your biggest bottlenecks with applications, right? One of them is memory, and the other one's disk, and then network maybe follows somewhere there. Not only just, I guess, applications, but a lot of the biggest bottlenecks with web development in general is the database, right? Your database bottlenecks. So optimizing, I think, like SQL, things like that also could be a good thing to add on to that. Let me drop a note about that, actually. There's optimization. Okay, so first thing, when you hop on your Linux server, a couple of things that you can run to just check the state of the land, sort of thing. It's a command called free. Free basically is just going to show you how much memory on the system is currently being used, or free if you put the -m flag on there. Let me zoom in a little bit more. If you put -m, it'll show you in megabytes, so it's a little easier to consume. So I can see I'm sitting on this Linux server right now. There's a total of 2 gigs on this thing. It's a little guy. I'm on an RC environment. I don't want to be bringing down production on a Saturday, so. Here you have how much is being used. Now, this number doesn't necessarily add up because a lot of it's being used by the actual system, buffer, cache, things like that. And then you've got some of that memory allocated for shared memory, and then how much of the memory that's actually free. So I've only got 177 megabytes of free memory on here, which is kind of low. If I were to just look at this system right now, if it were production, I would say we need to bump this up. And then you've got what's called swap. So once all of this memory is consumed, the system needs to then start storing stuff in somewhere else other than the RAM. So it has to start going into what's called swap, which is basically using the hard drive as a glorified RAM stick and using the actual hard drive to kind of store data. You never want swap because swap is way slower than actual memory. So the first kind of barometer that you want to use is looking at this. And just looking at it while the system is sleeping isn't a good representation of this too. When you log into Amazon like EC2, you'll have dashboards of how much memory is being used, and looking at that is a better barometer than just going on here, unless it's a really busy time. You know you're in peak time, that's probably a good time to take a look at how much memory do we have free on the servers. You probably have a cluster if it's a larger thing. If it's just a single server, this is much easier to do.
I have some feedback.
Yeah.
So the available column, in new versions of free, you have the available column all the way on the right. So that is the value that is available to the Linux kernel to allocate memory to new processes. Free, particularly, is the amount of memory that the system isn't using at all. The difference between those two numbers is actually the shared and the buffer and cache memory. Cached memory is the stuff that's used by the Linux kernel to store contents in the file system. So if you have a database server, it's going to be reading, it's going to be storing all of the data that was previously read before. So that way, if you ask for that data again, it's reading from RAM rather than from the disk. So what's actually available is the 1295. However, you might want a lot of storage or buffered and cache memory for a file system.
Is this configurable, or is it something that just kind of decides for you?
It's automatic, and you want it to happen, because Linux is keeping track of the memory that isn't in use by processes, and it will opportunistically use the free memory to store as file system cache. That's a good thing.
Got it.
But yeah, available is really the value you want to look at for how much memory is free for new processes.
Yeah.
Other than
Okay.
reading files, is there a way to pre-warm that cache?
I think preload. There's a Linux command that I ran into called preload that will intelligently look at processes that you run consistently, and it will cache those, I believe, in memory. So that way, when you run it again, all of it's already preloaded, right? That's the only one that I'm aware of. There are other tactics I know you can use too. For example, in the PHP world, a long time ago, you had Apache and PHP. It was like peanut butter and jelly, right? But it was using like FCGI, which basically needed to call PHP like at a command line level, and when that web request would come in, all of PHP would have to spin up, eat up memory, and start up Bootstrap before it could even handle the web request. And so what they started doing is this thing called PHP FPM. It's like a faster process management where it already boots up PHP. PHP is sitting there waiting for a web request, so it doesn't have to go through all that Bootstrap process when that request comes in. I'm sure it's similar in other languages too, where preloading the actual the application or even just the actual language interpreter will drastically speed up, web requests and stuff like that. But that's a good question. So other than memory, the other thing you want to look at is disk space, right? Same thing with this. You can use the -m to just give megabytes. And there's a lot here. A lot of it's Linux-ish stuff, like this loop stuff. I'm not even certain really what that is. The most important one is whatever actual disk you're using on the system. In this scenario, there are two disks that are important to us. One of them is the actual operating system, and then another is a drive that's dedicated to data. So things like the Docker images, the application code, anything that's basically not ephemeral will get put into this disk drive here. Typically, this is a good way to set up your servers. That way, you can kind of tear down this server and then just mount this same drive onto a new server. That way, you still have all your data and everything's there, logs or whatever you need. And the actual operating system can kind of get blown away or brought back, and you have a way of doing that. And same thing here, you kind of want to use this usage percent is nice. It gives you a very clear, okay, I'm using 62% of this disk. And there are a couple of bash scripts I've written that if you go on my GitHub and look up Remote Dev Force, we've got a couple of bash scripts that we open source that basically will monitor these two things. So it will monitor memory as well as the disk usage. And when those go over a certain threshold, you can plug in a webhook. In our case, we just have it just ping in Slack like, hey, but any webhook basically you can plug into the bash script, and then this just runs on a cron every minute, kind of checking stuff. I'm sure there are more fancier approaches to doing stuff like that as well. I know like with AWS, you've got CloudWatch and other things you can kind of trigger stuff off of. So it just depends on what environment you're in, really. But so that's kind of like the memory and the disk like world there. So I guess before we kind of continued, is there anything you think I'm missing other than like those two key things?
No, those are key. The disk space was real good. I harken back to the days of 2 megabyte hard disks, and I was always frightened every time I logged on at some log that got berserk, and fill up the hard drive. But with AWS, they have a nice monitor for CPU usage. That'll tell you a lot of things. If your CPU is spiking, you get an alert. And, I had a WordPress server of all things, and the guy that set it up wasn't very good. I don't know if it was hacked or whatever it was, but it kept spiking and crashing the server and stuff, and that was very
CPU, yeah. Okay, CPU use. That's actually good. What's that?
A really good tool to try on a Linux machine is called dstat. It's written by an old school Linux dude called Dag Leers, and it will display second-to-second CPU memory and network utilization, so you can see how hot the host is across multiple dimensions. What's it called? dstat.
Is it just like a Linux tool you can install?
You can install it in your prompt and run it right now.
Okay, let's give it a shot.
Yeah. Sorry, this is my bread and butter, man.
No, and it ain't mine, so I don't know why they chose me to do the talk, but this is why I got you guys here. So then just run it?
Just run dstat, yeah. Run that bad boy. There you go, see? So you got on the left, CPU utilization across all 5 of the Popper's dimensions. You got the read and write throughput on the disk and the network. You got, if you're hitting swap, you're just mentioning swap.
That paging would be swap,
That's
right?
right. And then the interrupts and context switches. But that'll give you all the goodies. So if you saw high user value or high weight value on the left-hand side, if you're, if you have application CPU bound or IO bound. So if you're dealing with disk performance issues, that weight is going to be really high, especially on like MySQL systems where it's just like long-running statements and stuff. But this tool is a great place to look first if you're trying to assess the health of the server and you don't have a monitoring system.
This is outstanding. Cool.
I've got one that tells you the core temperatures.
Core temperatures?
I need that too.
Back in the day, yeah. I always wanted a liquid cooling system, but never could afford it. But it'd be my luck, it'd short circuit everything anyway if I tried. Okay, cool. So that's outstanding. I love that. So that kind of covers, CPU. That was something I kind of forgot about. That's definitely one of those that you want to take a look at. Obviously, if it's always pinned at 100% or something, you probably need to give it a beefier machine, or take a look at your code. Maybe it's can be optimized on the code side. So that's that. Another thing I kind of wanted to go through, this was a really helpful article for me that I started looking at, and I'd love your folks' opinion on this as well. So these are kind of the top 10 things they listed as optimizing Linux performance. The first one I actually think is a very interesting one because basically it just says choose the right distribution. And many times I've seen developers instinctively pick Ubuntu because they use it in their desktop environment, and they just say, hey, I'll use it for my server environment as well. And there's not necessarily anything wrong there, but if you're trying to squeeze out that extra little bit of performance, you may want to consider a more lightweight distribution. So this is where they suggest something like Arch Linux or Gentoo, which are both lightweight. I am a fan of Arch Linux, especially when you get into the container world. So you're not just dealing with like bare metal servers, but let's say you're actually doing like, AWS ECS, or you're just doing container deployments on GCP, whatever. A lot of the time you want a small footprint for the actual Docker image container. When you're doing something like Ubuntu, there's just a lot of stuff that comes with it. You could very well use that for your containers. You just may want to consider uninstalling or cleaning things up to make sure that you're not running a bunch of bloatware on top of what you need to actually run. So Arch Linux, I think, is kind of the best go-to there. And any other thoughts, feedback on that whole thing? I know that it's a very because there's some people who are diehard, whatever, Debian or this or that, you know, so.
I think that Amazon Linux is pretty good if you're using AWS and you have a need for some of those tools. I like that a lot of those things are built into it.
Mhm.
A lot of the AWS tools are already installed for you. So, it would be
Yeah.
a little awkward to use for other kinds of applications sometimes, but I think it's pretty good.
It's not, yeah, it's
Isn't-
not bad.
Isn't Gentoo still built from scratch? So the installation is like a week,
Well, if you,
and that's if you know what you're doing?
I ran
Yeah, I think
Gentoo.
that's basically it.
I ran Gentoo on a Pentium 4 in my college days, and yes, it took a million years to compile your.
Yeah, it takes like a day just to set it up, and then it's like running for a week before, right?
Yeah, you have to build everything.
You have to
So,
build
like-
everything. I mean,
So
it's
I'm
a,
not sure like what you're doing if you need to be running Gentoo. Like,
Yeah.
I guess that's pretty specific, very hardcore.
yeah, right on.
Like, I mean, it's gonna be optimized for your architecture, it's gonna be like uber optimized, but like, what are you doing?
Yeah, there was a sysadmin I worked with that loved Gentoo, but nobody else could support that machine because he was the only one that knew how to compile because I think that's what it is, right? You're compiling everything basically. Like
You're
there's
building
doesn't necessarily
from scratch,
right.
And then on top of that, you even tell it like, how do you want to build? So like,
Yeah.
you could tell it, I want standard tools over here in this other directory that's completely non-standard, and it will happily do that.
Compile flags.
Yeah.
The whole gamut.
Yeah.
There is one thing that I would probably note. It depends on like. So yeah, yes. There's two things. One, the whole your point about containerization, like your container images. Yeah, you could run like Alpine or something where the footprint of the image is very low. 100%. But when it comes to like the underlying host, it really depends on like your needs. So for example, let's say you need to get security compliant. You might need to pick something that actually is FIPS certified, meaning you're probably going to move to Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or you can do Ubuntu LTS, because both of them have FIPS. Or yes, there is SUSE.
What is it? VIPS? VIPS?
Yeah, that's like a security compliance standard that the United States government provides. So there are certain Linux distributions that will do FIPS, and there's some that won't.
That's just good, right? Not using
Yeah,
FIPS.
as in Frank.
Sorry. Okay.
And then also distributions that provide a long-term support are going to be really useful because
Yeah,
you're not gonna have to
LTS.
do OS rebuilds every 2 years. Like a regular Ubuntu installation is going to be 2 years, but an LTS is going to be 5, and there's some that are like 10.
Yeah.
So it really depends on your use case. Like if I was running production stuff that like a business is going to depend on, I'd be picking an LTS of some kind.
That makes sense. Yeah, good point. We only got like 5 minutes, so I gotta kind of rush here, but keep your system up to date. I think that should be pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people don't. This one was interesting, disabling unnecessary services. I learned about this new, yeah.
Like, if you're running production servers, you don't just want to turn on upgrade on the production servers. You want to make sure that the upgrade isn't going to break your
Absolutely.
because as good as Linux is,
Yeah, sometimes this goes haywire. Yeah,
it's gonna,
yeah,
it's going to lose your stuff.
yeah, yeah,
You want to have like a test server for updates where you do that and you look at the servers, it's still running.
yeah. Running it in a lower is absolutely crucial. Yeah,
Some kind of sandbox thing.
yeah. This will display all the services that are running in Linux, which is kind of cool. I just found out about this. I've used the service before to kind of turn things on, so when the machine boots, it turns it on, but I learned that you can actually list everything and see what's on and kind of clean things up this way. So you can disable services, which is kind of cool. Optimizing the file system. I am hesitant to touch anything with the file system, but it suggests you can use tune to FS to turn off this no A time thing and raising this commit time. They said basically can boost things, but there's the increased risk of data loss if something were to happen. So yeah, I'm hesitant that this is a good idea, but yeah. The preload, I mentioned this, learned about that recently too. I got to play around with that a little bit. I don't know how important this is, keeping the disk clean in the sense of like, obviously with logs and stuff like that, you want to keep it clean, but it mentioned things like fragmented data. And
Journaling systems already do that automatically for you? Nowadays.
A lot of file system fragmentation isn't usually a thing with modern
that's
systems now.
That's like a FAT32 thing.
that's what I believe, yeah.
Not a journaling system.
EXT4, I think you're good, right? Like you don't really, yeah, so not relevant.
You want to like EPRFS or ZFS or something.
This one was interesting, optimizing your swappiness value, which apparently you can configure to have it not jump into swap, so immediate. I don't know, have you ever played with that before?
I've tweaked VM swappiness. I mean, in many of my production workloads that I've run, we don't even have swap turned on at all. But there have been some proponents where they say, oh, you should probably just have like, swap that's like a gig because there's like some Linux performance implications if you don't have swap at all. But yes, that basically just configures how aggressive Linux will be in swapping pages to the hard disk.
Okay.
Like I play around with this. Like I work for a client that their production servers were Raspberry Pi, which run on SD cards, and you don't want to write too much to it, and they ran 24 hours a day.
Oh wow.
So you want to turn down, you want to crank down the sloppiness so that it doesn't hit the SD card all the time and it burns it out.
Same can be said about SSD and NVMe drives,
Yeah.
because you can wear out your
SSD
disks.
drive they wear out eventually. So
Yeah.
So it's a thing. Yeah, it's a thing.
So you
Okay.
don't swap at all.
So you probably should turn it off is the point, yeah. But if you need it, yeah. This one, again, another one I'm hesitant to do, but customizing the kernel. This is the last one here. I know some diehard Linux people that do build their own kernels and stuff like that. Anytime I've tried, I've literally cratered systems, so that's why I'm hesitant, but I don't know if there's a...
That's the beginning stages of building a Gentoo system.
Yeah, you're a Gentoo.
You're right.
If you're a Gentoo guy, this is your thing.
Yeah.
Well, there is one reason. So like I do music production on my spare time, and I wouldn't necessarily go and like rebuild my kernel, but I would install the real-time versions. And most common distributions will build a real-time one, which basically tweaks like how processes are scheduled, which can be really useful for music, editing and things like that. But yeah, I'm not tweaking kernel params. I haven't done that since the mid-2000s.
Yeah, right. Cool. So we only got a couple minutes left. We got to wrap it up. But I guess in a talk like this, what else would be some good tidbits to include? Yeah.
The topic of pets versus cattle. So you can do a lot of these tweaks for a long-running system, and that may serve you well if you plan to run it for a long time. But in the modern environments that are virtualized and cloud-based, we want to think of servers as cattle that can come up and go down, right? And so it might be worth talking about how you can automate some of these tweaks. So if you're going to apply some of these settings, how do you do those at different scales or at the time of your creation of that box?
That makes sense.
I'm going to send you a slide deck that might be very interesting.
Okay, cool. To close this out, I have one JetBrains license to give away, 1-year license to any other products or sponsor. So if you need that, come grab me and I'll give you that. For next month, I think we might have a speaker, but if they fall through, I'd love if anybody wants to share something with the group. Please come approach me. I know, like Amin, for example, he just came to Vegas and he's like, hey, I want to speak. That's what the community is all about, right? So If you have a topic or you'd like to share just like a little quick thing like I just did, we'd love to have you. So definitely reach out to me. You can get, most of the information is on phpvegas.com. If you go there, you'll be able to find our meetup page by just going to upcoming meetups here. Or if you want to submit a demo for demo time, feel free to use that link there. But yeah, I guess before we close out, does anybody have any questions or anything about like kind of what we've gone through? No? Cool. All right, thanks for everyone for coming out. I appreciate it.